He paid $18 for her train ticket and expected nothing but a quiet woman to mend his shirts and keep the stove burning. He didn't want love. The harsh frontier had frozen the romance out of him years ago. But he never could have anticipated a woman like Clara. Wallace Reed stood on the warped wooden planks of the Bitter Creek Depot, his thumbs hooked into his suspenders. He was 32, though the sun and the biting Dakota wind had etched the lines of a much older man into his face. In his breast pocket rested a crumpled telegram. Arriving Thursday. Stop. Clara Bennett. Stop. He didn't harbor any grand illusions about this arrangement. Wallace needed a partner in labor, not in love. His ranch, a sprawling, unforgiving stretch of short-grass prairie 50 miles from the nearest proper town, was too much for one man to maintain and keep a house besides. He needed someone to haul water, boil laundry, and keep the winter drafts patched while he ran the cattle. He had placed an advertisement in a Boston paper. She had answered. It was a transaction. Simple. Cold. Necessary. The Union Pacific locomotive shrieked in the distance, a plume of black smoke staining the pale afternoon sky. Wallace shifted his weight. His boots were scuffed, caked with dry mud. He watched the train pull into the station with a deafening hiss of steam and grinding iron. Passengers disembarked in a trickle. A traveling salesman in a cheap suit. 2 rough-looking miners. And then, her. Clara Bennett stepped down from the passenger car. She didn't look like the fragile, weeping Eastern women Wallace had occasionally seen pass through. The ones who took one look at the barren plains and bought a return ticket the next day. She wore a faded gray wool dress, hemmed an inch too short, revealing sturdy leather lace-up boots. She held a battered carpet bag in one hand. Her hair, the color of wet straw, was pulled back severely under a plain bonnet. Wallace stepped forward. He didn't take his hat off. "Miss Bennett?" She turned. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue. They were tired. Deeply, profoundly tired. But they didn't drop his gaze. "Mr. Reed, you look exactly like the photograph," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact. She was plain, thin, and looked like she hadn't eaten a hot meal in a week. "I appreciate the honesty," Clara replied. Her voice was slightly hoarse, stripped of any musical lilt. "The train ride was long. I'm ready to see my new home." He nodded, taking the carpet bag from her hand. It was astonishingly light. He didn't ask if she had a trunk. If this was all she owned, it wasn't his business. Wagons out back. The ride to the ranch took 3 hours. They didn't speak. Wallace focused on the rumps of his 2 draft horses, feeling the familiar jarring rhythm of the wooden wheels rolling over rutted dirt. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She sat rigidly upright on the hard bench, her hands folded in her lap. The wind tore at her bonnet, whipping stray strands of hair across her face. She didn't complain about the dust coating her teeth or the biting chill in the autumn air. She just watched the endless, empty horizon. When they crested the final ridge, the ranch came into view. It was a stark collection of structures. A sod-roofed cabin built from rough-hewn timber, a weathered barn, and a sprawling network of split-rail corrals. There were no trees, no flower boxes, just raw, unyielding earth. Wallace pulled the team to a halt. He wrapped the reins around the brake lever and looked at her, waiting for the inevitable disappointment. The tears. The sudden realization of the miserable life she had signed up for. Clara climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his help. She walked to the front door of the cabin, pushed it open, and stepped inside. Wallace followed, carrying her bag. The cabin was one main room, smelling of old coffee, wood smoke, and sweat. A cast-iron stove sat in the center. A crude table and 2 chairs occupied one corner. A single bed lay against the far wall. "I'll take the loft," Wallace said, his voice flat. He pointed to a wooden ladder leading to a half-floor beneath the rafters. "The bed down here is yours. I rise at 4. Breakfast needs to be ready by 5. I don't care what it is, as long as it's hot. Laundry is on Mondays. If you need supplies, you write them on the slate by the door. We go to town once a month." He waited. He wanted her to understand the gravity of the isolation. Clara ran a finger along the dusty surface of the table. She looked at her dust-coated finger, then back at Wallace. "Where is the well?" she asked. Wallace blinked. "Out back, 30 yards past the woodpile." "And the lye soap?" "Under the wash basin." She nodded, untying her bonnet and setting it on the table. "I'll need to scrub this floor before dark. If you want dinner by 6, you'd better show me how to work the dampers on that stove." Wallace stared at her for a long second. He gave a single curt nod. "Right." That night they ate salted pork and dry biscuits in silence. The only sound was the howling of the wind against the timber walls and the crackle of the fire. When Wallace climbed the ladder to his pallet in the loft, he lay on his back, staring at the pitch-black ceiling. Below him, he could hear the rustle of coarse blankets as Clara settled into the bed. He had expected a burden. He had expected a nuisance. Instead, he had a ghost. A quiet, efficient shadow who demanded nothing. He told himself this was exactly what he wanted. The first 3 weeks were a masterclass in silent endurance. They moved around each other like strangers trapped in a confined space. Wallace stayed out with the herd as long as daylight permitted, mending fences, branding late calves, exhausting himself so he wouldn't have to face the quiet of the cabin. Clara worked like a woman possessed. She didn't just maintain the house. She waged war on it. The grease-stained floorboards were scrubbed raw. The blackened windows were polished until they gleamed. The heavy, unwashed quilts Wallace had ignored for years were dragged out, boiled, and hung on the line to dry in the sharp wind. He noticed the toll it took. He wasn't blind. He saw the angry red blisters forming on her palms when she gripped her coffee cup in the morning. He saw the slight limp in her step by evening, the way she favored her left leg after hauling heavy pails of water from the well. But he said nothing. She didn't ask for pity, and he didn't offer any. Pity was a useless currency out here. It wasn't until late October that the fragile transactional wall between them cracked. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a single afternoon. A brutal early frost rolled in from the north, painting the prairie silver and turning the ground to iron. Wallace was in the lower pasture, struggling to herd a group of stubborn heifers toward the windbreak. The cold bit through his canvas coat like a serrated knife. When he finally rode back to the barn, the sky was a bruising, bruised purple. He was half frozen, his fingers stiff and clumsy as he fumbled with the saddle girth. He expected to find the house dark, save for the glow of the stove. He expected his dinner to be left warming under a tin plate while Clara slept. Instead, the barn doors swung open. Clara stood there. She held a kerosene lantern high, the yellow light catching the condensation of her breath. She wore one of his old, oversized flannel shirts over her dress, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. "What are you doing out here?" Wallace barked, his voice rougher than he intended. "It's freezing." "The pregnant mare," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but her teeth were chattering. "She went down about an hour ago. She's struggling." Wallace dropped the saddle. He hurried past her, down the central aisle of the barn. In the last stall, his best draft horse, a heavy roan named Bess, lay on her side in the straw. She was heaving, covered in a sheen of cold sweat. Wallace cursed under his breath. He knelt in the muck, running his hands over the mare's swollen belly. "Foal's turned. She can't get it out." He stripped off his coat, tossing it over the stall door. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing his forearms to the biting cold. "I need hot water, as much as you can carry, and a clean rope. Go." Clara didn't hesitate. She didn't panic. She set the lantern on a hook and ran for the cabin. For the next 3 hours, they fought a desperate, bloody battle in the freezing barn. Wallace had his arms inside the mare, struggling blindly to turn the foal. It was exhausting, agonizing work. The horse thrashed, nearly kicking Wallace in the jaw twice. Through it all, Clara was there. She brought bucket after bucket of steaming water. She held the horse's heavy head, murmuring softly in a low, soothing cadence Wallace had never heard her use. When Wallace's grip slipped, his arm slick with blood and amniotic fluid, she was right beside him. "Here," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy, panicked breathing of the horse. She shoved a length of rough hemp rope into his hands. "Tie it to the forelegs. I'll pull when you guide it." Wallace looked up at her. Her face was smudged with dirt and blood. Her hair had escaped its tight bun, hanging in damp tendrils around her face. She looked fierce. She looked beautiful. The thought hit him so abruptly he almost lost his balance. "Pull," he grunted, finding the foal's delicate legs and securing the rope. Clara braced her boots against the wooden slats of the stall. She wrapped the rope around her blistered hands and leaned back with everything she had. Wallace guided the foal, shouting directions. "Hold! Now pull! Harder, Clara!" With a sickening squelch and a final exhausted groan from the mare, the foal slid free onto the straw. It was a wet, steaming mass of dark hair. Wallace quickly cleared its airways, wiping the membrane from its nose and mouth. A second later, the foal took a jagged breath, its sides heaving, and let out a weak, reedy whinny. Wallace sat back heavily in the straw. He was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, his arms coated in grime. He looked across the stall. Clara was slumped against the wall, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked down at her hands. The rope had torn open the blisters on her palms. Blood mingled with the dirt on her skin. Wallace didn't think. He acted. He crawled across the straw, pulling his kerchief from his back pocket. He reached out and gently took her hands in his. Clara flinched, pulling back slightly. "Hold still," he said. His voice was no longer a bark. It was quiet, rough, but careful. He used a corner of the cloth, dipping it into a bucket of relatively clean, lukewarm water, and began to dab at her torn skin. He felt the fine trembling of her fingers. For the first time since she arrived, he felt the terrible, fragile humanity of the woman sitting across from him. "You didn't have to stay out here," Wallace said, not looking up from her hands. "You could have stayed in the house, by the fire." Claire watched him. "I'm not a parlor ornament, Wallace. I told you I'd work." He looked up. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. "I didn't buy a ranch hand, Clara. I asked for a wife." "You asked for survival," she corrected quietly, pulling her hands back, though she let the kerchief remain wrapped around her palm. "That's what we're both doing. Surviving." She stood up, her legs shaky. She looked at the foal, now weakly trying to stand, nudging its mother. A ghost of a smile touched the corners of her mouth. the very first smile Wallace had seen. "I'll make coffee," she said, turning toward the barn doors. "Wash up and come inside before you catch your death." Wallace sat in the blood-soaked straw for a long time after she left. He listened to the wind rattling the barn roof. He looked at his own trembling hands. He had prepared himself for a cold, loveless marriage. He had built walls of ice around his chest, convinced that nothing could thaw them. But as he looked toward the cabin, seeing the warm orange glow of the firelights spilling out the windows into the freezing Dakota night, he realized the ice was already beginning to melt. Winter hit the Dakota territory not with a warning, but with a hammer. By late December, the snowdrift swallowed the lower corrals and banked against the cabin walls entirely, burying them in a muffled white tomb. The world shrank to a single room of split logs, the radiant heat of the cast-iron stove, and the grueling, freezing trek to the barn twice a day. They were trapped together, months of forced proximity pressed against them. Wallace waited for the cabin fever to set in. He waited for Clara to snap, to hurl a cast-iron skillet at the wall, to weep for the bustling streets of Boston. It never happened. Instead, a strange, quiet rhythm settled over the house. He noticed the small things first. When he came in from chopping wood, his hands numb and his beard crusted with ice, there was always a fresh cup of chicory coffee sitting on the table. Not a word accompanied it, just the steam rising in the dim light. When she washed his heavy canvas work shirts, she took the time to meticulously stitch the frayed cuffs, reinforcing the seams with thick thread. In return, Wallace found himself altering his own rigid habits. He started kicking his muddy boots off on the porch instead of tracking dirt across her clean floors. When he rode into town for their monthly supplies in January, braving a bitter headwind, he didn't just buy the flour, salt, and coffee on her slate. He stood in the general store, staring at a display of goods, before tossing 2 extra items onto the counter: a tin of hard lemon candies and a thick blue wool shawl. He had dropped them on the table when he returned, brushing the snow from his coat. "Storekeeper threw them in for a bulk purchase," he lied, his voice gruff. He didn't look at her as he carried the sacks of flour to the pantry. Clara had touched the soft wool of the shawl, her calloused fingers catching slightly on the fabric. She didn't press him on the lie. But that evening, she wore it draped over her shoulders as she mended socks by the fire. The silence between them stretched, but it lost its sharp edges. It became comfortable, heavy with unspoken things, but no longer hostile. It broke on a Tuesday in February. Outside, a blizzard howled, shaking the timber frame of the cabin. Wallace sat at the table, using an awl to punch new holes in a broken leather bridle. Clara sat across from him, slicing dried apples. "My father owed men money," she said suddenly. Wallace paused. He didn't look up, keeping his hand steady on the leather. He didn't want to spook her. It was the first time she had offered a piece of herself without being asked. "Bad men? The kind who take their payment out of your skin when the cash runs dry," Clara replied. Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity. "He died of consumption. The debt transferred to me. I worked 14 hours a day at the textile mill. The machines were deafening. The air was so thick with cotton dust you coughed up gray phlegm. They took 90% of my wages to pay the interest on his debt." She set the knife down. She looked at her hands, rough, blistered, scarred from the rope burn in the barn months ago. "One of the debt collectors told me I could pay it off faster if I entertained him in the evenings." I knew what that meant. She met Wallace's gaze, her pale blue eyes hard and unblinking in the firelight. I saw your advertisement the next morning in a discarded newspaper. A train ticket away from Boston. A roof. A lawful marriage. I packed my carpet bag that night and walked to the station. Wallace set the awl down. The wind battered the door, a low, moaning sound. You didn't come here for a husband, Wallace said softly. You came for a shield. I came for a chance, she corrected. I traded one kind of hard labor for another. But out here, the air is clean, and no one is coming to collect the debt. She swallowed hard, looking away for a fraction of a second. I know I am not what you wanted, Wallace. I'm not soft. I don't know how to be a proper wife. Wallace looked at this woman. He remembered the night with the foaling mare. He remembered the way she hauled water until her shoulders ached, the way she faced down the brutal prairie winter without a single word of complaint. He thought of the delicate, useless Eastern women he had seen break under the weight of this life. He reached across the scarred wooden table. He didn't grab her hand. He simply laid his large, calloused palm up on the wood between them. An invitation. Clara stared at his hand. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and rested her fingers against his. Her skin was rough, her knuckles swollen from the cold water and lye soap. To Wallace, it was the most beautiful touch he had ever felt. I didn't want soft, Clara, he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. Soft gets you killed out here. I wanted a partner. He tightened his fingers around hers. I reckon I got one. April arrived, and the thaw was worse than the freeze. The snowmelt turned the Dakota plains into a treacherous sucking bog. The creek that cut through the lower pasture swelled from a trickle to a raging, muddy torrent. The days were a chaotic rush of dragging bog cattle from the mud and repairing fences that the winter weight had snapped like twigs. They were working as a unit now, a well-oiled machine. Wallace handled the heavy timber and the herd. Clara managed the calves, the barn, and kept them both fed and functioning. They still didn't exchange sweet nothings. They didn't have time for romance in the traditional sense. Their affection was spoken in action. Wallace waking an hour earlier to warm the cabin before she rose. Clara leaving the largest, best cut of salted pork on his plate after a brutal day in the mud. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the creek finally gave way. Wallace had ridden out on his gelding to chase down 3 stray heifers that had wandered too close to the eroding banks. The sky was a bruised gunmetal gray, spitting a cold, relentless rain. Clara was in the barn, pitching fresh straw for the horses, when she heard the distinct, terrifying sound of a horse screaming. She dropped the pitchfork. She didn't grab her shawl. She bolted from the barn, sprinting through the driving rain toward the lower pasture. The mud sucked at her boots, threatening to pull her down, but she kept moving, her lungs burning. When she crested the rise, her heart stopped. The bank had collapsed. The gelding had scrambled up the muddy slope, panicked and loose. But Wallace was down. He was pinned beneath a massive waterlogged cottonwood trunk that the floodwaters had swept onto the bank. Half of his body was submerged in the freezing, fast-moving water. "Wallace!" Clara screamed, her voice tearing through the sound of the rushing creek. She slid down the muddy embankment, crashing into the icy water beside him. Wallace was pale, his teeth locked in a grimace. The water was dragging at his coat, threatening to pull him under the log entirely. "Legs caught," he gritted out, his voice strained. "Can't move it." Clara didn't panic. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. She grabbed the rough bark of the cottonwood and pulled with all her strength. The log didn't budge an inch. It weighed hundreds of pounds. The water level was rising, washing over Wallace's chest. "Go back!" Wallace coughed, his lips turning blue. "Water's too cold. You'll freeze." "Ah, shut up," Clara snarled. She scrambled up the bank, slipping in the mud, grabbing the trailing reins of the panicked gelding. She dragged the horse down the slope. Her hands were shaking from the cold, but her knots were tight. She unclipped the heavy leather lariat from Wallace's saddle, looped it securely under the submerged end of the log, and tied a brutal double half-hitch to the saddle horn. She waded back into the freezing water, wrapping her arms around Wallace's chest. "I'm going to pull you out as soon as the log lifts. Be ready." "Clara!" "I said be ready." She whipped her head around and screamed at the horse. "Ha! Get up! Ha!" She slapped the gelding's rump hard. The horse surged forward. The leather rope snapped taut, groaning under the immense pressure. The gelding dug its hooves into the mud, muscles bunching, straining against the weight of the waterlogged tree. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a sickening suction sound, the log shifted. It lifted just a few inches. It was enough. Clara hauled backwards, dragging Wallace through the mud and out from under the crushing weight, just as the gelding slipped and the log slammed back down into the water. She dragged him entirely out of the creek, up the slope, until they collapsed in the tall, wet prairie grass. The rain beat down on them. Wallace was gasping, clutching his right leg. The denim was torn, and the angle of his calf was wrong. Broken. Clara crawled over to him. She was covered in freezing mud, trembling violently. She leaned over him, inspecting the leg, pressing her hands against his chest to feel his racing heart. Wallace looked up at her through the rain. Her hair was plastered to her skull. She looked wild, exhausted, and terrifying. He reached up, grabbing the front of her sodden dress, pulling her down toward him. He didn't care about the mud or the cold. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruised, and tasting of rain and dirt. It was a collision of survival and absolute, undeniable relief. Clara froze for a fraction of a second, and then she kissed him back, her cold fingers tangling in his wet hair. When he finally broke away, they were both breathing heavily, forehead to forehead. "I reckon you saved my life," Wallace rasped, his voice shaking from the adrenaline and the cold. Clara looked down at him, a fierce blazing light in her tired blue eyes. "You're my partner, Wallace Reed. I protect what's mine." He let out a weak, barking laugh that turned into a groan of pain as he shifted his leg. "Then you'd better get what's yours into the house, woman, before I freeze to death." It took 2 hours to get him back to the cabin, splint the leg with axe handles, and get him into the bed near the roaring stove. Later that night, the rain stopped. The cabin was warm, smelling of drying wool and wood smoke. Wallace lay in the bed, his leg elevated. Clara sat in the wooden chair beside him, tending to the fire. He reached out, his hand finding hers in the dim light. He pulled her gently, and she didn't resist. She slipped from the chair and lay down carefully beside him on the narrow bed, resting her head on his chest, being mindful of his splint. Wallace wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. He listened to her steady breathing, feeling the solid, real warmth of her against him. He had paid $18 for a stranger to wash his shirts. He had prepared for a bitter, loveless existence on the edge of the world. Instead, he had found his heart in the unlikeliest of places, beating right here, wrapped in faded gray wool, proving that even in the hardest, coldest earth, something beautiful could take root and refuse to die. If this story struck a chord with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more grounded, real tales of the American frontier. Love isn't always a fairy tale. Sometimes it's forged in the mud, the cold, and the relentless fight to survive. Share this video with someone who knows the value of hard work and true devotion. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next story of the Wild West. See you down the trail